companion's mockery and the anger on his face became even more intense. He quickly retreated to a corner of the altar. The blood on his chest had already dyed his green scales black. I didn't expect it. I really didn't expect it. The green-armored monster looked at Lin Bai, and his tone was a little crazy. What? At this moment, the thin man only felt that the aura of death and the aura of blood on the altar was getting thicker and thicker, and he was shocked. The aura of the green-armored monster increased, and balls of black aura surrounded his four limbs. The long knife in his hand was shining, as if it was craving for fresh blood. The wound on his chest, which was covered with white bones, stopped bleeding and healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. The wound healed, but this is too fast. On the altar, the thick smell of blood and the bone-chilling killing intent had reached its peak. The thin man only felt drops of sweat dripping down, and his heart thumped. In the next moment, his heart seemed like it was about to jump out of his throat, and he didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. The two monsters in front of him were emitting an aura that was becoming more and more violent. They were like the descendants of ancient fierce beasts, thirsting for the primitive desire to be violent and kill. Lin Bai could not help but feel solemn. This green-armored monster seemed to be stepping on thousands of living beings and wading through mountains of corpses and seas of blood. No, this was not as if he had actually killed thousands of living beings. Otherwise, no matter how heaven-defying the monster was, it would not have such pure and dense killing intent. Oh, you finally know fear? Unfortunately, it's too late. Even if you kneel down and beg for mercy now, I will not let you off. The green-armored monster's face was full of murderous intent, and its scarlet eyes were shining. The corners of its mouth suddenly split open, revealing two sharp fangs. Ran, don't forget the reason why we're here. If you do this, you'll explode. Seeing the green-armored monster's strange behavior, the black-furred monster said coldly. Its words had a direction, but it was interrupted by the green-armored monster impatiently. Shut up, Sean. Do you think I don't know? Right now, I'm just stretching my limbs before the main event. It's like a small dish before a real feast. Ran and Sean? Lin Bai frowned. Through the conversation between the two monsters, he finally knew their names. However, just knowing their names still confused him. Did they really come from another world? However, the subsequent changes of the green-armored monster made Lin Bai no longer have the time or energy to think about these questions. The green-armored monster named Ran ignored the suggestion of the black-furred monster named Sean. A thick, viscous black gas emerged from Ran's body. It covered his entire body like a solid armor, covering his green scales and turning his entire body pitch black. Ran took a light step forward and lightly stepped on the altar. Crack, crack, the solid surface of the altar, the surface that Little Black and Little Blue had to use all their strength to destroy, had been stepped on by someone else and a hole was made? For the first time, Little Black and Little Blue felt the shock and fear that shot straight into their souls. Then, they looked in Lin Bai's direction with worry. Lin Bai stood quietly where he was. The strong wind blew against his robes, causing his hair to flutter wildly in the air. However, his eyes were as still water, as calm as an ancient well. Aunt, I will definitely take those eyes of yours. I want to take a good look at what makes you so disgusting. However, his tone was cold and his voice had become a little hoarse. However, the killing intent contained within it was dozens of times stronger than before. Whoosh! A weak air-breaking sound was heard. It was accompanied by a violent wind that made it difficult for people to open their eyes. Ran, whose entire body was wrapped in demonic chi, arrived in front of Lin Bai in the blink of an eye. He swung his hand toward Lin Bai's chest and abdomen in an extremely awkward position. The move was decisive and ruthless. There was no sloppiness at all, except for the strange way of exerting strength. Lin Bai took a small step back with his toes. His hands suddenly swung forward. He held the sword in one hand and the tripod in the other. The long sword flickered with a dense silver light. The sacred golden light on the cauldron reflected each other, and the power of the attack suddenly increased as it smashed toward Ran's hand. This move of Lin Bai's contained 100% of his power. He planned to use his full power in the first exchange, so that Ran, who was still careless, would suffer a big loss. Then, he could take advantage of the situation and turn the situation around. However, before the silver light of the longsword and the golden light of the small cauldron collided with Ran's attack, the two weapons were struck first, and the attack, which had yet to gather its full strength, dissipated. Following that, a series of loud sounds spread out. Ran's hand collided with the longsword and the small cauldron, and Lin Bai was repeatedly pushed back by this huge force. His chi and blood began to boil. Just now, before his attack hit his opponent's hand, he was hit first, and then he was hit by Ran's real attack. No, that couldn't be called an attack. It was the devil chi that RRN emitted from his body. It was the black armor that wrapped around his body. However, no one knew what method Ran used to make the demon chi on his arm become transparent. It couldn't be seen at all, so Lin Bai was at a disadvantage. This kind of move, which could not allow the opponent to control the distance or make it disappear, could be said to be a great headache in a fight. It could give one a great advantage, a strong physique and that layer of demon chi armor. Lin Bai felt his blood boiling. This was not like before, when his chi and blood were surging and affecting the circulation of his cultivation method. Instead, it made Lin Bai's body heat up. His fighting spirit was burning, and his eyes were like torches. Ran, who was covered in black demon chi, saw Lin Bai's gaze, and a feeling of extreme disgust surged from the bottom of his heart. This disgust struck the deepest part of his heart. However, just as Ran was about to launch an attack to clean up the disgust in his eyes, Lin Bai took the initiative to launch an attack. This caused Ran to be slightly shocked. The longsword in Lin Bai's hand suddenly swung from top to bottom, gradually reaching the lowest point. It moved from frivolous to right, and almost at the same time, it swung from right to left. It's useless even if you see through it. Seeing this, however, he became convinced in his heart. Lin Bai had seen through the secret of his demon chi armor, but he did not care at all. He swung the large cleaver in his hand forward and hacked. The two strikes of the long sword were easily shattered by the large cleaver, and the large cleaver was like a greedy beast that had an insatiable thirst for blood. It was still unstoppable as it hacked at Lin Bai. Lin Bai channeled his spiritual power into the small cauldron. The two collided, and both of them were bounced back. However, he only felt pain between his thumb and forefinger. The more painful it was, the more he looked at the small cauldron with a wild and greedy gaze. At this moment, a fair hand turned into the shape of a claw and pierced straight towards Ran's right abdomen. The angle was tricky, and the speed was as fast as lightning. Humph! It's useless. You want to hurt me with just this attack of yours? Ran's face showed disdain. The armor on his body was made of demonic chi. Not only did it have a strong defense, it would also automatically launch an attack the moment it came into contact with the opponent. Previously, he had used this to neutralize the attack of the longsword and the small cauldron. Then, he struck out with his palm and injured Lin Bai. However, just as Lin Bai's hand was about to touch the armor, a golden light flashed over and crashed into the armor at a speed that was difficult to be seen with the naked eye. The demon chi armor launched its own attack and collided with the golden light. Both of them dissipated. However, where the golden light and the armor touched, there was a small circle where the demon chi became thin. One could vaguely see the green scale armor inside. Poochie, blood splattered out, accompanied by a monstrous roar. Ah! Ran clutched his injured abdomen and quickly retreated backward. Under the pull of the movement, the lacerated wound on his abdomen was bleeding profusely. However, how could Lin Bai let go of this opportunity to turn the situation around? His figure flashed, and he stepped on the ground with the tip of his feet. He suddenly appeared in front of Ran and stabbed his longsword at Ran's injured abdomen. This sword attack of Lin Bai's did not seek strength, but only precision and speed. It was like a rainbow that cut through the night, and in the blink of an eye, it was approaching Ran's abdomen. You! Ran took a deep breath, and he felt a chill from his abdomen directly pressing into his mind. At the same time, he hurriedly launched a few strong attacks, trying to block the longsword while allowing Lin Bai to dodge left and right to fight for an opportunity to retreat. However, After a few attacks, Rant's abdomen was torn open again, and blood dyed half of his body red. The intense pain made him lose the ability to calm down and think, so he could only grit his teeth and rely on his subconscious. His wound had already begun to heal slowly. He only needed a few breaths of time to catch his breath, and he was confident that he could get rid of this disadvantage. Lin Bai obviously knew this as well. As he waved his long sword, he suddenly activated a huge amount of spiritual power and injected it into the small cauldron. The small cauldron suddenly emitted a bright golden light. "You think you can exterminate me with just your power?" Rand shouted coldly, but he couldn't help but mutter in his heart. He had gotten close to the small cauldron in Lin Bai's hand several times and even used the large knife with a slit to contend with it. Even so, he still couldn't see the true face of this small cauldron clearly. However, he had a feeling that this small cauldron had yet to display its true power. If this small cauldron were to display its full power, then he was somewhat doubtful of whether he would be able to withstand it. However, he forcefully endured the tearing sensation in his abdomen and clenched his teeth as he brandished the large cleaver. A scarlet light emitted from the body of the large cleaver. It was devilishly cold-blooded and filled with a murderous aura as it hacked towards the direction of the small cauldron. A streak of golden light and a streak of red light. Both of them emitted a crushing aura, as if they wanted to tear apart, destroy, and shatter everything in the world. However, just as the two streaks of light were about to collide, a faint and concealed white light flickered. A figure approached Ran at lightning speed. Lin Bai's left hand transformed into a palm blade and slashed towards Rant's neck. "You're playing dirty with me." He was shocked. Only now did he understand that although Little Cauldron's attack seemed to be fierce, it was actually a feint attack. Ran wanted to stop the large cleaver in his hand, but that was simply impossible. In order to block Little Cauldron's frontal attack, he used all his strength. Moreover, if he withdrew the large cleaver, then he would not be able to dodge the small cauldron's attack. Ran raised a leg and kicked Lin Bai's chest. This kick was aggressive and carried a wave of anger. If an ordinary person was kicked, their chest would definitely turn into minced meat. Unfortunately, this was Rant's hasty attack, the worst move. Lin Bai twisted his body and dodged this kick. He placed one hand on Rant's leg and used the other hand to stab at Rant's chest. Rant's eyes went from calmness to anger to confusion. He looked at the hand knife that Lin Bai was stabbing at him. He had the intention to dodge and defend, but there was no time at all. He could only watch as the hand knife approached bit by bit. Lin Bai only felt a warm sensation on his fingertips. He was delighted. If he could get rid of one just like that, then he could easily get rid of the remaining one with the help of the others. However, just as Lin Bai's hand knife was about to enter Rant's chest, Rant's body uncontrollably retreated. Lin Bai's hand also came out of his chest. He could not get any deeper into the wound and stabbed straight into his heart. However, when the small cauldron and the long cleaver collided, Ran hesitated and was pulled back by someone. The force on the long cleaver had already been removed and half of his body had sunk into the golden light. "Ran, you're too careless. How are you going to complete our mission like this?" A rough voice sounded. Sean had somehow escaped the siege of Skinny and the others and came to rescue Ran. Drip drip. Fresh blood continuously fell on the altar. Rant's forehead was covered in sweat. The layer of dark demonic chi on his body had dissipated, revealing green scales. There were deep wounds on his left chest and left abdomen. Blood gushed out, and half of his right arm was gone. Sean had saved him in an emergency, and this arm was the price he had to pay. However, from Shan's point of view, it was still better than dying here. However, he bit down hard on his roots, and with a cracking sound, a pair of scarlet eyes stared at Lin Bai, and he roared angrily. "Insect!" The angry roar, filled with murderous intent, resounded throughout the entire secret chamber. Lin Bai stretched out his little finger and dug his ears, then placed it in front of his mouth and blew gently. He asked in confusion, "What did you say? I didn't hear you clearly. Can you repeat it again?" "It was you. You were almost killed by me. You only know how to run, coward." Lin Bai bit the word coward very hard. When Ran heard it, He was about to flare up immediately. However, Shan placed his heavy palm on his shoulder. Ran, if that's all you have, then I'll do the mission alone. You can't shoulder such a heavy responsibility. When Lin Bai heard this, he started to mutter in his heart. He had originally thought that Shan was the one who was easily enraged and easily obsessed with battle. However, he had not expected Shan to have a calm and thoughtful look under his violent exterior. Ran gritted his teeth and took out a few medicinal pills from his bag. He stuffed them into his mouth and swallowed them. Lin Bai. The thin man and Bai Shi had reached Lin Bai's side, and their eyes were apologetic. They had wanted to stop Shan, but Shan suddenly exploded with a powerful force and didn't dodge their attacks at all, so they couldn't stop him. Lin Bai shook his head, indicating that he didn't care. The battle was always changing at a moment's notice. No matter how careful a plan was, there would be continuous changes, so Shan and Ran couldn't do anything about it. Now, he had to think about what to do next. Haha. Shan looked at Lin Bai and the others and laughed. I didn't expect that there would be someone as interesting as you among the humans. How about come and be our subordinate and help us complete our great cause? In that case, even if the humans are completely massacred by us in the future, I can still ensure your long-term survival. Shan said this to Lin Bai. When he said this, his gaze was fixed on Lin Bai, the thin man, and Bai Shi. You want to bring that burden with you after completing your great undertaking? Lin Bai looked at Ran, who had closed his eyes to recuperate, and said coldly. Shan smiled and did not answer this question. How is it? Do you intend to help me? Then kill that guy behind you and throw his head over. I can consider it. Lin Bai said coldly and looked at Ran. Ran, who was sitting behind the mountain, had stopped bleeding from his chest and abdomen. His wounds were gradually healing. Even the most serious injury on his right arm was no longer bleeding. Lin Bai knew that he could not delay any longer. Shan's pair of scarlet, savage eyes carefully sized up Lin Bai for a moment. A smile blossomed on his sinister face, causing it to become even more sinister. Kid, looks like you have a lot of secrets on you. For example, that small cauldron. For example, those spirit beasts behind you. However, don't worry. As long as you help us, we can guarantee that no one from our side will covet your secrets while we allow you to rise to the top. Shan Xian was quick-witted. He immediately came to the conclusion that it wasn't a wise move to recklessly engage in battle with Lin Bai and the others while Ran was injured. If he had been a little careless, it was fine if Ran died, but he might suffer a setback as well. However, if Lin Bai and the rest attacked him forcefully, Shan would not be afraid. Shan was chosen to come to this world not only because he had a strong body and a fierce face. How many powerful people in this world did not have secrets? Lin Bai understood Shan's intention. He wanted to stall for some time so that he could recover. Shan chose to stall for time alone and did not choose to run away. This meant that he was confident that he could fight Lin Bai and the rest. Hence, Lin Bai immediately ruled out the plan to attack rashly. Lin Bai had a myriad of thoughts in his mind, but his face was as calm as water. It was so clear that one could see the bottom of it. There was even a smile on his lips that was charming. You're right. I do have some secrets. Before I decide if I should help you or not, I still have a few questions. Lin Bai stopped mid-sentence. The thin man and Bai Shi had different expressions as they looked at Lin Bai. No one knew what they were thinking about. Shan's ferocious face relaxed for a moment. He glanced at Ran from the corner of his eye. Ran's injuries were recovering rapidly. He still needed some time. You can ask me. As long as you can answer, I can answer appropriately. You are demons? Demons? Shan laughed dryly. However, in your world, there is such a name. We are demons. Therefore, you demons have long coveted this world, or rather, something from this world. You secretly sent a person here a long time ago, hiding here as your informant, and the appearance of the two of you is naturally the result of that person. Shan's eyes flashed with a strange light, and the sinister smile on his face froze for a moment, not letting others notice anything unusual. As long as you agree to help us, you can know all these questions. Lin Bai nodded in his heart when he heard this, and he was even more certain of his guess. The city lord was a demon. The Shan and Ran in front of him were also demons. They were coveting this world, or rather, something in this world, and they were spending a large amount of time and manpower to obtain it. It was the same for a demon to be driven away by interests. But this interest was not as simple as Lin Bai had guessed. It should be a bigger hidden secret. Then I still have a few questions. Lin Bai did not look surprised when he saw that Shan did not answer. Instead, he asked other questions with great interest. The thin man and Bai Shi looked at Lin Bai again. Their expressions were different. The thin man lowered his gaze and returned to Lin Bai. He had something to say but was also worried. Shan's eyes lit up and he nodded. You can say it. Rant's injuries had already recovered by half. He would be able to use 80% of his strength in a short period of time. When that time came, he and Ran would be able to hold the initiative. Lin Bai asked a few more questions about Ran and Shan. Among them, there was also a vague mention of the City Lord. However, Shan's answers were exceptionally smooth. He did not mention anything that should not be mentioned at all. He did not allow Lin Bai to obtain any useful information. However, one or two questions were still acceptable. Lin Bai kept asking questions, causing Shan to start mumbling in his heart. Wasn't I the one who should be stalling for time? Could it be that Lin Bai was meticulously planning some plan and was intentionally stalling for some time with me? No matter what plans he had, it would be useless. Moreover, from Lin Bai's performance, he seemed to be a person with an extremely deep mind. Then he should be able to guess my plan. The more Shan replied, the more he muttered in his heart. The more he helped to stall for time, the more chaotic his heart became. Shan's scarlet eyes sized up the calm and composed Lin Bai, the pensive Bai Shi, and the nervous and hesitant skinny man. Boom! At this moment, a dazzling ball of fire attacked from above the darkness. It was like a sun falling onto the earth, carrying with it a heat wave that burned everything. It's a trap! Shan shouted. Not good! He opened his mouth and spat out a ball of black gas that was emitting a deathly aura. It smashed towards the ball of fire. The two collided and exploded, setting off waves of strong air currents. When Shan received this attack, he felt that two figures had already arrived in front of him. They attacked from both left and right at tricky angles, vowing to take Shan's life. Shan waved his hands, his fingertips wrapped in black gas. He easily received the two attacks, but before he could stop, another black and blue figure attacked him. Shan could only brace himself to fight again. Little Blue's attack had left a deep wound on his arm. Buzz! A holy and ancient golden light was like an ancient holy light, crushing everything in its path. It was menacing as it devoured Shan. Shan felt a headache coming on. When he saw the golden light, he knew that it was the work of the small cauldron. The small cauldron had made Ran suffer quite a bit before, so he did not dare to be careless. He urged the demonic chi in his body to attack with all his might. All of these attacks only happened in the span of 2 breaths. They were powerful and extremely fast. If it were anyone else, they would have already died here. No, that's not right. Just as he took the small cauldron's attack, Shan Xian's heart trembled. He seemed to have thought of something as he twisted his legs, and his muscular body suddenly moved backward. Ran was recuperating with his eyes closed. He had already reached the final step and would be able to join hands with him in a moment. However, a figure had appeared behind Ran at some point in time. That figure's expression was calm as the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. His fair hand moved from top to bottom in a seemingly light stroke. Poochie! Blood splattered everywhere. Rant's head rolled onto the ground powerlessly. His scarlet eyes were filled with shock. Following that, Rant's green armored body collapsed powerlessly and lost its life force. You! Shan let out a deafening roar. There were even quite a number of rocks that rolled down from above due to the shock. Sigh. Your fault for not telling me all those questions? Lin Bai smiled slyly and shook off the blood stains on his hands. The reason why Lin Bai wanted to talk so much with Shan was to make Shan, who was very suspicious, suspect that Lin Bai had other motives. When Shan was in such a dilemma, it was the time for Lin Bai to make a move. If they did not deal with Ran at this time, once he recovered from his injuries, Lin Bai and the others would fall into an irreversible disadvantage. There was no trace of pity or emotion in Lin Bai's eyes. He extended his index finger and pointed into the distance. Rant's ferocious head that was covered in blood exploded like an expanding balloon with a bang. Lin Bai did not do this to vent his anger, but to anger Shan in front of him. When Shan saw this scene, anger, killing intent, and ruthlessness took over his head and took away his rationality. It also caused the demonic chi around his body to surge and churn, as if a monstrous troll had appeared in the mortal world. It was filled with a terror that penetrated deep into one's soul. The turbulent and churning demonic chi curled around Shan's muscular body and lay dormant on his arms. It was as if two fierce beasts were crouching on his arms, staring menacingly at him. It was strange and terrifying. Hiss! When the thin man saw the changes on Shan's body, he could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. The two fierce beasts on Shan's arms made the thin man raise his guard. He did not dare to be the slightest bit careless. At the same time, he looked at Lin Bai. Phew, you really scared me. I thought you. The thin man swallowed his words halfway through his sentence. When the thin man saw that Lin Bai and Shan were stalling for time, he really thought that Lin Bai was planning to join forces with Shan and betray them. However, it was fortunate that during this period of time when he was in contact with Lin Bai, he learned the hint Lin Bai gave to attack. He launched an attack together with Bai Shi. We need to end this battle quickly. The commotion from before was too big, so we can't avoid attracting the attention of others. Bai Shi also came to Lin Bai's side and said in a low voice. While Lin Bai and Shan were talking to stall for time, Bai Shi was also confused at first. However, after standing in Lin Bai's position and thinking for a while, she came to a realization and cooperated with Lin Bai to work his act to the extreme. Lin Bai nodded and gave the order to the little beasts at the same time. Immediately, Lin Bai's feet lightly swayed, leaving an illusory shadow on the spot. In the blink of an eye, he arrived in front of Shan. Previously, I activated the small cauldron too many times. Now, I only have a quarter of my spiritual power left. I can probably use the small cauldron to its full power twice. If I can't finish off Shan before my spiritual power is exhausted, then we'll have to run. Lin Bai's mind spun rapidly as he urged a large amount of spiritual power into the small cauldron. The small cauldron was like a bottomless abyss, wantonly swallowing Lin Bai's spiritual power. It did not show any signs of filling up. Buzz! The small cauldron immediately released a dazzling golden light. Immediately, a holy golden light smashed towards the mountain. There's still one more time. Lin Bai's eyes were like torches. The long sword in his right hand stabbed towards the mountain's temple at an extremely cunning angle. Shan's hand, which was surrounded by demonic chi, clenched his fist tightly and smashed towards the small cauldron with a loud bang. His other hand opened his palm and grabbed towards Lin Bai's sharp swordlight. When the thin man saw this, his originally solemn face revealed a trace of a smile. Idiot, even if your two hands are very special, if you want to receive it with your bare hands, isn't that a little too arrogant? Before the thin man could finish his words, his face stiffened. Boom. After two booming sounds, Shan received the attack steadily. His footsteps were even more steady as he stood on the ground. His ferocious face did not show any signs of difficulty. When Lin Bai saw this, he was a little surprised. However, he did not think too much about it. He drew his long sword and swung it once again. At the same time, a jet-black figure attacked. A claw that was emitting a cold light grabbed towards the lower part of Shan's body. Shan gave a cold snort, raised his thick and strong leg, and suddenly twisted it inward. Demonic chi also surrounded him, and both of his hands smashed towards Lin Bai's long sword. Poochie! A tearing sound echoed through the altar. A deep wound that was so deep that one could see the bone was left on Shan's thigh, and fresh blood kept gushing out. Shan's expression changed slightly. He had never thought that the black spiritual beast that he had always looked down on would have such destructive power. Little Black made a face at Shan and waved its claws at him a few more times. I'll let you look down on me again. Do you still dare to? Shan almost spat out a mouthful of blood when he saw such a human-like spiritual beast. Boom! A dazzling fireball and a stream of water vapor came crashing down from both sides of the Shan. Shan originally wanted to step on the ground and jump up high, but he did not expect a blue figure to attack him from above. Shan braced himself and placed his hands on his chest. In front of him, demonic chi surged and wrapped around his body. After a dazzling light, Shan panted and retreated. After taking the attacks of 3 spiritual beasts, he was already heavily injured. Although his injuries were small, if he continued to fight, hee. At this moment, a sinister laugh came from behind Shan, causing all the hair on his body to stand on end. Poochie. After a flash of silver light, a dagger stabbed into Shan's ribs. This was the result of Shan subconsciously dodging the attack. Otherwise, there would have been a dagger stabbed into Shan's back. Seeing that Shan wanted to counterattack, the thin man quickly pulled out his dagger and swallowed it into the darkness once again. Don't blame me for being heartless. You're a demon, I'm a human. Bai she shouted coldly and launched a fierce attack, not giving Shan any time to catch his breath. Under the siege, even if Shan had brute force and a chest full of trump cards, he did not have the time to catch his breath. He could only continuously block the attacks. A moment later, Shan's body was left with several bloody wounds. His black hair was mixed with the smell of blood and stuck to his body. Lin Bai attacked from the front. He held his long sword in his hand and stabbed forward with lightning-like momentum. Suddenly, a stream of black gas emerged from the darkness and swept toward the altar aggressively. Retreat. Lin Bai could feel the difference in this black gas. He hurriedly withdrew his long sword and retreated quickly. Little Red knowingly spat towards the black gas. The scorching fire and the black gas collided and both dissipated. Hee. A sinister laughter resounded throughout the entire altar. A solemn expression appeared on the faces of the thin man and Bai Shi. They were very familiar with this laughter. It was so familiar that they could not be more familiar with it. In front of the bloody Shan, a figure stood. It was the city lord who had rushed over. The city lord's expression was gloomy and cold. The corners of his mouth curled up. Under his seemingly calm eyes, there was a surging anger that surged to the heavens. He stared fixedly at Lin Bai. "Where's Ran?" the city lord asked coldly. However, just as he finished speaking, he saw a headless body collapsing at the corner of the altar. "Ran died," Shan replied succinctly. Taking advantage of this time, he hurriedly swallowed all sorts of medicine and began to recuperate from the injuries all over his body. Crack, crack, crack. The city lord clenched his fists tightly, and his fists repeatedly let out explosive sounds. With each explosive sound, the skinny man and Bai Shi's mood became even more solemn. "Lin Bai, you've ruined my plans several times, and now," the city lord said halfway, gritting his teeth. "Today, this altar will be your burial place." "Did you say anything just now?" "I didn't hear it very clearly." Lin Bai took out his little finger from his ear and looked at the city lord with a face full of doubt. "You can only be stubborn now." The city lord was so angry that he laughed instead. His gaze swept over Lin Bai and the others. "What a pity. It's a pity that the fatty who betrayed us, and that person who looked honest and had an honest face, but is actually full of evil schemes, are not here. What a pity. Otherwise, I would especially like to meet them." The city lord emphasized the word "especially" very heavily. The city lord was still thinking about looking for Fatty, which meant that Fatty was still alive. However, who was that honest-looking fellow who was actually filled with evil schemes? Looking at your expressions, you haven't met those 2 idiots yet. However, no matter where they hide, I will find them one by one and pull out their tendons and bones. Otherwise, it would be difficult to resolve the hatred in my heart. The city lord's voice became colder and colder, and his voice became lower and lower. However, everyone present could not help but feel their hearts tremble, as if they had fallen into an ice hole. No, that's not right. Lin Bai quickly came to a realization. This feeling of falling into an ice hole was not only because of the city lord's words. At this point, if it was not intentional, the city lord would not have mentioned Fatty at all. Ha ha ha, you realized it. Not bad, Lin Bai. Otherwise, all of this would be too boring. I still want to see all of you struggle with your lives on the line until the end, with faces full of despair. Seeing Lin Bai's expression, the smile on the city lord's face became even more savage. and his expression was even more confident. Undying Ghost Technique. Now this place is my hunting ground. Every move that happens here is under my control. All of you will die here today, and none of you can think of escaping, ha ha ha. The city lord had already treated Lin Bai and the others like fish on a chopping board. He did not hold back as he spoke the name of the cultivation technique. He laughed maniacally. At this moment, Lin Bai and the others finally realized the changes on the altar. The surface of the altar had unknowingly been covered by a thin layer of demon chi. The range of this demon chi was spreading at a speed visible to the naked eye. We can't be careless. There must be something strange about the city lord's cultivation technique. Sean is still recovering from his injuries. However, if we let him recover 70 to 80% of his prime, the two of them attacking us together will be very disadvantageous to us. Lin Bai quietly said to the thin man and Bai Shi behind him. At the same time, he wrapped his legs with spiritual energy. His legs were still isolated from the demonic chi on the altar, but the demonic chi did not have any negative effect on him. Then what was the use of this demonic chi? He remembered the city lord had just said that this place was his hunting ground. A very bad guess emerged in Lin Bai's mind. No matter what kind of stupid cultivation technique this is, we can only brace ourselves and go. The thin man's brows were tightly knitted together, and his mind was nervous. However, before he could finish his words, his eyes were wide open. Looking at the scene in front of him, he was so shocked that he could not utter a single word. Shua. Ah! A piercing sound rang out, accompanied by a horrifying scream. Bai Shi hurriedly retreated, clutching a bloody arm. There was a deep wound on her elbow that could see the bones. If she had not subconsciously activated her defense, then the injury would not have been as simple as just one arm. Her entire body would have been split into two. The city lord's figure swayed again, and he returned to the front of Sean. His right upper right hand was covered in blood. SK, your cultivation is too low. The taste of your blood is not good enough. The blood of you human women and those with high cultivation are still not bad. The city lord stuck out his tongue to taste the taste of the blood on his fingertip. His face revealed an excited and satisfied expression, and his smile became even more twisted. Bai Shi, don't blame me. I warned you a long time ago, but who would have thought that you would still be unrepentant? Bai Shi's face was covered in sweat the size of soybeans, and her skin was pale and colorless. Her breathing was rapid, and her vision gradually began to blur. The intense pain almost made her faint, but she knew very well that if she fainted here, it would only put Lin Bai and the others at an even greater disadvantage. That was because Lin Bai and the thin man had to protect him while fighting the city lord. The difficulty would increase by more than one level. Little Black, Lin Bai shouted softly, and Little Black immediately understood what he meant. He twisted his shiny black body and moved closer to Bai Shi. He gave Lin Bai a determined expression and said, "Leave this place to me. I won't let her suffer any harm." Whether it was the three of them or the few spirit beasts, when it came to defense, Little Black was definitely number one. Even the thin man had relied on Little Black's terrifying defense when he cleared the high platforms. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to escape from there. After realizing the true power of the small cauldron, Lin Bai was still a little scared. Back then, he wasn't afraid of death and allowed Little Black to compete with the small cauldron. Fortunately, the small cauldron didn't show its power at that time, or Little Black would be lucky to have a minor injury. Bai Shi looked at Lin Bai gratefully. She pressed many times on her injured arm, forcibly sealing her acupoints to stop the bleeding. Then, she hurriedly swallowed medicine. Bai Shi, now that things have come to this, do you have any regrets? You say, what's the use of continuing to struggle on with your life? Why don't you end your own life here, or completely become my slave? Only then will you be able to atone for your sins. Regret your words. Bai Shi bit out each word from between her teeth. Her eyes were bloodshot as she looked at the city lord, filled with the desire to fight. She even spat at the city lord with a mouthful of saliva mixed with fresh blood. He, the city lord laughed, and his expression darkened. You have to think clearly, think about it. The city lord's words were cold and sinister. However, halfway through his words, The city lord who had been standing where he was disappeared once again, leaving behind a pitch-black figure. "Skinny, be careful," Lin Bai shouted loudly. At the same time, he exerted strength under his feet and rushed towards the skinny man. The little cauldron and the cold longsword were both drawn. Poochie. Fresh blood splattered everywhere. The skinny man's left shoulder received a blow, and he hurriedly withdrew into the darkness. If Lin Bai had not reacted in advance and informed the skinny man would probably have been severely injured just like Bai Shi. After 2 attacks, 2 people were injured. Lin Bai couldn't help but be on high alert. He knew why the city lord hadn't chosen him as his target twice. It was because he wanted to play with, torture, and ravage him, so as to eliminate the flames of anger in his heart. In the city lord's undying ghost technique, Lin Bai had already preliminarily determined that this undying ghost technique, which had a limited range, could greatly increase the city lord's speed. However, the ability of the undying ghost technique was definitely not limited to this. There must be other abilities that Lin Bai had yet to discover. "Lin Bai, do you regret making an enemy out of me?" The city lord asked coldly, shaking off the blood on his hand. "If you prostrate yourself before me now and beg for mercy, and enter into a contract with me to become my slave for eternity, I can spare you from the pain of flesh and blood." The city lord's lips contained a sinister smile, and his gaze was like that of a coiled viper, eyeing covetously. There must be something strange about the city lord's cultivation technique. Shan is still recovering from his injuries. However, if we let him recover 70 to 80% of his prime, the 2 of them attacking us together will be very disadvantageous to us. Lin Bai quietly said to the thin man and Bai Shi behind him. At the same time, he wrapped his legs with spiritual energy. His legs were still isolated from the demonic chi on the altar, but the demonic chi did not have any negative effect on him. Then what was the use of this demonic chi? He remembered the city lord had just said that this place was his hunting ground. A very bad guess emerged in Lin Bai's mind. No matter what kind of stupid cultivation technique this is, we can only brace ourselves and go. The thin man's brows were tightly knitted together, and his mind was nervous. However, before he could finish his words, his eyes were wide open. Looking at the scene in front of him, he was so shocked that he could not utter a single word. Shua. Ah! A piercing sound rang out, accompanied by a horrifying scream. Bai Shi hurriedly retreated, clutching a bloody arm. There was a deep wound on her elbow that could see the bones. If she had not subconsciously activated her defense, then the injury would not have been as simple as just one arm. Her entire body would have been split into 2. The city lord's figure swayed again, and he returned to the front of Shan. His right upper right hand was covered in blood. "SK, your cultivation is too low. The taste of your blood is not good enough. The blood of you human women and those with high cultivation are still not bad." The city lord stuck out his tongue to taste the taste of the blood on his fingertip. His face revealed an excited and satisfied expression, and his smile became even more twisted. "Bai Shi, don't blame me. I warned you a long time ago, but who would have thought that you would still be unrepentant?" Bai Shi's face was covered in sweat the size of soybeans, and her skin was pale and colorless. Her breathing was rapid, and her vision gradually began to blur. The intense pain almost made her faint, but she knew very well that if she fainted here, it would only put Lin Bai and the others at an even greater disadvantage. That was because Lin Bai and the thin man had to protect him while fighting the city lord. The difficulty would increase by more than one level. "Little Black," Lin Bai shouted softly, and Little Black immediately understood what he meant. He twisted his shiny black body and moved closer to Bai Shi. He gave Lin Bai a determined expression and said, "Leave this place to me. I won't let her suffer any harm." Whether it was the 3 of them or the few spirit beasts, when it came to defense, Little Black was definitely number 1. Even the thin man had relied on Little Black's terrifying defense when he cleared the high platforms. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to escape from there. After realizing the true power of the small cauldron, Lin Bai was still a little scared. Back then, he wasn't afraid of death and allowed Little Black to compete with the small cauldron. Fortunately, The small cauldron didn't show its power at that time, or Little Black would be lucky to have a minor injury. But she looked at Lin Bai gratefully. She pressed many times on her injured arm, forcibly sealing her acupoints to stop the bleeding. Then, she hurriedly swallowed medicine. By she, now that things have come to this, do you have any regrets? You say, what's the use of continuing to struggle on with your life? Why don't you end your own life here, or completely become my slave? Only then will you be able to atone for your sins. Regret your words. Why she bit out each word from between her teeth. Her eyes were bloodshot as she looked at the city lord, filled with the desire to fight. She even spat at the city lord with a mouthful of saliva mixed with fresh blood. He, the city lord laughed, and his expression darkened. You have to think clearly, think about it. The city lord's words were cold and sinister. However, halfway through his words, the city lord who had been standing where he was disappeared once again, leaving behind a pitch-black figure. Skinny, be careful, Lin Bai shouted loudly. At the same time, he exerted strength under his feet and rushed towards the skinny man. The little cauldron and the cold longsword were both drawn. Poochie, fresh blood splattered everywhere. The skinny man's left shoulder received a blow, and he hurriedly withdrew into the darkness. If Lin Bai had not reacted in advance and informed the skinny man would probably have been severely injured just like Bai Shi. After 2 attacks, 2 people were injured. Lin Bai couldn't help but be on high alert. He knew why the city lord hadn't chosen him as his target twice. It was because he wanted to play with, torture, and ravage him, so as to eliminate the flames of anger in his heart. In the city lord's undying ghost technique, Lin Bai had already preliminarily determined that this undying ghost technique, which had a limited range, could greatly increase the city lord's speed. However, the ability of the undying ghost technique was definitely not limited to this. There must be other abilities that Lin Bai had yet to discover. Lin Bai, do you regret making an enemy out of me? The city lord asked coldly, shaking off the blood on his hand. If you prostrate yourself before me now and beg for mercy, and enter into a contract with me to become my slave for eternity, I can spare you from the pain of flesh and blood. The city lord's lips contained a sinister smile, and his gaze was like that of a coiled viper, eyeing covetously. You have to think this through carefully. The city lord's smile was cold and sinister, revealing an expression that he had everything under control. Shan sat cross-legged not far behind the city lord. White mist was rising from his body, and the bloody injuries on his body were mostly healed. It would not take long for him to join hands with the city lord. Now that Bai Shi and the thin man were both injured, if Shan and the city lord were to join hands, Lin Bai's heart sank. Bai Shi was recuperating under the protection of Little Black and had already lost the ability to fight. Thin Man was also heavily injured, and his strength had been greatly reduced. If he chose to cover them while escaping from here, it would be the worst option. The city lord would definitely stop him in every way possible. At that time, Lin Bai would be multitasking, and he would definitely expose a flaw. Suddenly, a faint sound of air being torn apart could be heard. Lin Bai subconsciously looked in the direction of the city lord, but the city lord still stood where he was and did not move at all. Lin Bai only felt his scalp go numb. His body leaned forward, and without turning his head, he rolled. Then, he suddenly exerted strength under his feet and jumped to the other side of the altar. Only then did he clearly see that where he was standing, there was a figure covered in darkness. That figure's shape and posture were 90% similar to the city lord's. F***CK. The skinny man hiding in the darkness could not help but look behind him when he saw this scene. At the same time, Little Black only felt an attack coming from behind him. He suddenly leaned back and waved his sharp claws. A ball of pitch-black city lord turned into a sticky, stinky liquid that fused with the demon chi that enveloped the altar. Little Black looked pleased and waved his claws at Lin Bai. How is it? Hee, not bad, right? I don't care if he's human or demon, bring it on. Seeing that Little Black had succeeded, Little Blue praised it from the bottom of its heart. It jumped up and down, making Little Black look even more pleased. When Lin Bai and the skinny man saw this scene, they felt nervous. Their worries were instantly turned into ashes by the two funny little beasts. Suddenly, "Be careful," Lin Bai shouted. The pitch-black version of the City Lord, which had been destroyed by Little Black, showed up again. It held a strange-shaped long sword in its hand and stabbed directly in the direction of Bai Shi. Seeing this, Little Black could only clench its teeth and use its body to take this attack head-on. Bang! The pitch-black long sword, which had a strange-shaped shape, shattered bit by bit when it collided with Little Black. It turned into a sticky, stinky liquid and merged with the demon chi on the altar. Whoosh! Blackie wiped the sweat off its forehead in a human-like manner, not daring to be the slightest bit careless. If not for Lin Bai's timely reminder, that black shadow might have really killed Bai Shi. What a headache! Lin Bai quickly turned around. Not far behind him, two City Lord clones had already appeared. Lin Bai brandished the sword in his hand and took the lead in launching an attack, causing the two clones to dissipate and disappear. But this isn't a solution. Even if we destroy them once, they'll recover a second time and a third time. Only by destroying the source can we solve it. Lin Bai muttered in his heart. The source was the City Lord who stood in the middle of the altar and had everything under control. He was also looking at everyone with an enjoyable mood. Who? But right at this moment, the thing that Lin Bai didn't want to happen the most happened. Shan let out a breath of turbid air and opened his eyes. There was a piercing red light blossoming in his eyes. He slowly stood up and stretched his muscles and bones. Crack, crack. A series of ear-splitting explosions sounded. Useless thing. Once you wake up, quickly get rid of them with me. We must catch Lin Bai alive. He still has many secrets on him. Useless thing. The City Lord shouted coldly. Shan's face was dark, and his body was slightly hunched as he stood behind the City Lord. At this moment, the City Lord looked at Lin Bai coldly. He stretched out his scarlet tongue and licked his thin lips. "Yes, sir," Shan said in a deep voice. In the darkness outside the altar, one was fat and the other was strong. The two of them were lying behind a huge rock, stuck out their heads, and held their breaths as they looked down. F***CK. This indestructible ghost technique can create clones? Fatty's face was full of shock, and his face was slightly pale. Although these clones aren't as strong as the main body, they have the advantage of numbers and can't be destroyed. Fu Hu analyzed calmly. Shan is going to make a move now. When are we going to help them? Fatty's heart was filled with impatience. Earlier, he had seen Bai Shi and Skinny being injured one after another. If not for Fu Hu pressing down on his shoulders, Fatty would have already charged forward. It's still not the time. Fu Hu shook his head. It's still not the time? Fatty gritted his teeth. If you want to help them and not give yourself over for free, then listen to me. Fu Hu's voice became serious. The City Lord hasn't discovered us yet. We're in the dark, and he's in the open. This is a huge advantage for us. We must find the right time to make him suffer. Fatty gritted his teeth and suppressed his emotions. Leave those two ants to me. Shan looked at the pitch-black empty space, then at Little Black and Bai Shi. F***CK. The skinny man cursed. He thought that he had disguised himself to the extreme and had completely blended into the darkness. However, Shan stood up and saw through his position with just a glance. Little Black's eyes were like torches as he stared at Shan, not daring to be the slightest bit careless. The City Lord did not say anything, which meant that he had agreed to Shan's plan. Shan's black fur began to flutter as he threw a fierce punch towards Little Black. Behind Little Black was Bai Shi, so he could only brace himself and strike out with his claw. Boom! Little Black took 2 steps back, while Shan took 1 step back. Shan's fist smashed out with a loud bang, and dense white bones broke out of its skin. His little finger was only connected by the skin, and it was already a bloody mess. Shan looked at the injured fist in surprise, but there was no painful expression on his face. Haha, this spirit beast is interesting. Can I keep this little beast's life? The City Lord said indifferently, as you wish. Shan used his other hand to caress the injured fist, accompanied by a scalp-numbing cracking sound. The thick white bones on the fist were reset. The little finger that was only connected by the skin began to grow pink, tender flesh. Shan suddenly turned around, his face full of disdain. His elbow smashed into the darkness. Ants in the darkness should rot in there and never come out. Crack! A crisp sound of metal was heard. The dagger in the thin man's hand shattered, and scarlet blood oozed out from between his thumb and forefinger. The thin man was just about to escape into the darkness when two City Lord clones attacked him from both sides. He could only brace himself and enter another bitter battle. On the other side, the City Lord's clones appeared behind Little Black and Bai Shi respectively. Little Black could only turn his head and accept the battle. Shan naturally would not let go of this opportunity. His feet suddenly swayed, and sharp claws waved out, attacking the thin man from the bottom up. The thin man's heart trembled as he looked at the approaching attack. A pale and powerless feeling arose. All sorts of scenes from the past appeared in the thin man's mind like a passing lantern. No, the thin man shouted in his heart. Ants should die obediently and not dream of turning the world upside down. Shan's tone was cold and emotionless. To him, killing the thin man was like squashing an ant. It was a trivial matter. Lin Bai originally wanted to stop Shan, but the City Lord was the first to block him. At the same time, he used the Undying Ghost technique. For City Lord's clones attacked him, making it difficult for Lin Bai to do anything. Lin Bai, do you realize that there is an insurmountable chasm between us? It doesn't matter if you don't. I will let you know bit by bit. The City Lord's lips curled up, and a sinister smile hung on his face. In his and Shan's eyes, the thin man was already a bloody corpse that had lost its vitality. Poochie, flesh. The sound of flesh being torn apart and pierced through made one's teeth ache. You! Accompanied by a monstrous roar. Hee hee, did I not make it in time? A familiar and wretched laughter rang out. It was Fatty. Fatty pulled his hand out from behind Shan and brought out a bloody piece of meat, lungs. Shan coughed out a mouthful of fresh blood and suddenly turned around. He grabbed towards Fatty's neck, wanting to crush this ant, who came out to cause trouble halfway into meat paste. Too timely. The thin man's face was pale and his forehead was covered in sweat. However, past experience told the thin man that he could not let go of this opportunity. Taking advantage of Shan's attention on Fatty, he moved his feet and raised his arm, stabbing towards Shan's wound with his dagger. The thin man and Fatty had worked together for many years, and their teamwork was flawless. Under the pincer attack from both sides, Shan could only hurriedly dodge. He covered his bloody wound and quickly hid towards the City Lord's side. Crack! Fatty once again landed on the mountain. A deep wound was left on his leg. After a round of fighting, Shan's black fur was stained with sticky blood and emitted a strong fishy smell. Shan's muscular body also became dispirited, like a balloon that had leaked air. The thin man and the fat man stood together and communicated with each other in a low voice before retreating to Lin Bai's side. The City Lord's face turned gloomy. He looked around at the darkness around him and said in a cold voice, "There should be an ant in this dark place. Don't hide anymore. We won't be hit by the same move twice." Shan's internal organs had been injured this time. If he wanted to recover his battle strength, he would need a long time to recuperate. If they did not have a special method, such injuries would have left serious side effects. The situation took a turn for the worse, and the City Lord's plan was completely ruined. The altar that he had spent so much effort to build was destroyed by Lin Bai, and he only had time to teleport Shan over. After that, he fell, and Shan was seriously injured. Ever since he met Lin Bai, the City Lord had not encountered a single good thing. His meticulous plans had been destroyed by Lin Bai time and time again. The City Lord's scarlet eyes were filled with madness, ruthlessness, and hatred. At this moment, a gust of cold wind blew past. The thin man and Fatty could not help but shiver. This gust of wind carried a thick and violent aura, causing their hearts to jump. Cough, then I won't hide anymore. Fu-Hu walked out of the darkness silently and stood beside Fatty. Fu-Hu deliberately put some distance between him and the City Lord, but he was also very close to Fatty. This was to prevent the City Lord from suddenly attacking out of anger. Lin Bai and Fatty could also save him. At that moment, the city lord's body was emitting a vicious aura. Fu Hu did not dare to let down his guard at all. He felt like he was being eyed by a desolate beast. Lin Bai glanced at Fatty and then at Fu Hu. Since this person was brought by Fatty, he could temporarily believe him. However, Fu Hu gave Lin Bai a feeling of not being able to believe him. That simple and honest face always gave Lin Bai a feeling of hypocrisy. Fatty noticed Lin Bai's gaze and gave him a look. You can't trust the person beside you. You must be careful. Lin Bai nodded slightly. Fu Hu only felt that the two of them were exchanging glances. However, he was completely confused as to what exactly they were exchanging. Lin Bai retracted his gaze and looked at the Shan behind the city lord. Shan's physical body was already withered, and its aura was already weak. It could be seen that Fatty had heavily injured it. If nothing unexpected happened, Shan would not be able to continue fighting. It would require a long period of recuperation. On his side, Bai Shi no longer had the ability to fight. The thin man was also injured, but Fatty and Fu Hu were still unharmed. Lin Bai heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. Just a few seconds ago, it seemed that their side was facing the abyss, but now, they had reached the top of Mount Tai. We specially waited by the side just to find a good opportunity. Fatty's face was filled with excitement as he started to show off to the skinny man. The skinny man did not think much of it. If you continue to wait for an opportunity, I'll lose my life. Although the thin man was grateful to the fatty, the two of them had been brothers for so many years. When it came to the word thank you, the thin man felt goosebumps all over his body. This time, we should be able to easily get rid of the city lord, right? The matter is finally coming to an end. After I get rid of him, I'll definitely go find my 10 young girls. The fatty closed his eyes and started fantasizing. In his opinion, the outcome of this battle had already been decided, and there was no possibility of turning it around. The thin man could not help but ridicule. With that fat waist of yours, finding 10? Even finding half of them would be difficult. Heh, you still dare to say that I... Just as the thin man and fatty were about to start their rare bickering, they were interrupted by Fu Hu, who was originally silent. Fu Hu laughed coldly. If it was really as easy as you said, the city lord wouldn't have survived until now. Don't compare your head to someone else's head. The fatty glared at Fu Hu in annoyance. After a long period of contact, he had more or less gotten used to Fu Hu's mouth. We have so many people, and there are still a few spirit beasts. The path of retreat of this altar has been blocked by us. That is the right time, the right place, and the right people. The thin man was infuriated by the sudden appearance of Fu Hu. What else can he do? Don't destroy our prestige and boost his morale. Noisy, really noisy. The city lord's face darkened. He had heard the conversation between the thin man and the other two. The more he listened, the angrier he became. Aren't you looking down on me too much? The city lord said indignantly. Don't forget that you are still within my undying ghost technique. Netherworld prison. Oh no, let's go. Lin Bai shouted and tried to leave the range of the altar. However, as soon as he took a step forward, the thin layer of demon chi on the altar seemed to come alive. In the next second, Lin Bai was trapped in a pitch-black prison. In the pitch-black prison where one could not even see their fingers. Who is there? Fatty's voice was shrill, like a frightened girl. F***CK. Fu Hu cursed and covered his ear that was pricked by the shrill voice. Can you be Kingman? My ear. Whoosh. Fatty felt his face was a little hot, but he didn't care at all. He let out a long sigh. After he calmed down, Fatty said indifferently, Why am I with you? Such bad luck. Fu Hu laughed in the darkness. Do you think that I want to be with a burden like you? Just now, who said that the city lord is already a fish on the chopping board, ready to be slaughtered by us? Fatty was a little embarrassed and quickly changed the topic. This is the Netherworld prison. It can't be as simple as trapping us, right? Also, Fu Hu, do you have a lighter? Or something else that can illuminate us? After that, Fu Hu and Fatty each searched their pockets. The two of them took a long time to find a candle and pondered for a long time before lighting it up. Crack, crack. The candle was lit, and sparks lit up, lighting up the netherworld prison. As the netherworld prison was too dark and the candle's brightness was too low, the two of them moved to the side of the candle, and only then could they vaguely see each other through the flames. But even so, it had brought great comfort to the two of them psychologically. If the City Lord wants to trap all of us and think of a way to break us one by one, then he will need to expend a lot of spiritual energy. He must be overloading his cultivation at this moment. Fu Hu sat cross-legged on the ground and began to analyze the current situation. So, we just need to sit here and wait for the City Lord's spirit energy to run out? The fatty frowned. His fat face was squeezed together, making the originally small face even smaller. Fu Hu revealed an expression that said, "You think he will let you sit here and wait, can you not?" Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. At the same time, more than a dozen pitch-black figures emerged, and each pitch-black figure is in fact a City Lord clone. I don't believe he can hold us off all by himself. The fatty rolled up his sleeves, spit in the palm of his mouth, stood up in a huff, fiercely pounced on that one of the clones. His left and right fists were brandished one after another, crushing everything in their path in an imposing manner. In just a few breaths' time, half of his distraction had been destroyed. It's just a paper tiger. There's no need to be afraid. Fatty's face was filled with disdain as he charged towards the remaining clones in one go. His eyes were already filled with the joy of victory. Inside the prison that was only illuminated by a candle, Fatty and Fu, who could only see a limited area. However, due to the fact that they were all martial artists, their five senses were extremely sensitive. They only needed to make a small sound, and they would be able to draw out the outline, position, and movements of the other party in the darkness. Fatty and the City Lord's split attention sparring used the other senses outside of his sight. After a few more breaths, Fatty clapped his hands and laughed loudly. Just this? Ha, the netherworld prison? I thought it was something. Fu Hu, you coward, just watch from the side. When Fatty first met the City Lord's clone, he was still a little scared. However, after personally experiencing the strength of the clone, he only had the pleasure of torturing noobs and slaughtering them. Then I'll have to rely on you. Fu Hu gave a rare flattery. Fatty was already in the pleasure of victory and slaughtering. When he heard this flattery, his mind started to wander. Ha, you know how talk. At this moment, Fatty had completely forgotten that not long ago, he had told Lin Bai with his eyes that Fu Hu's words could not be trusted. Fu Hu stood beside the candle and looked at the 1/5 of the candle that had already been burned. Then, he looked at the clones of the City Lords. After each clone was defeated, it would turn into a sticky liquid and melt under their feet. No, it should be the prison around them right now. At this point, the situation was exactly the same as before the netherworld prison was activated. There must be other special parts of the netherworld prison, Fu Hu muttered in his heart. He looked like he was doing nothing, but he was extremely vigilant in his heart. Swoosh! The City Lord's clones that had been defeated gathered again and transformed into the City Lord's appearance. They surged toward Fatty's direction. Wait, it changed. Fu Hu discovered that each clone was smaller than before. No, not only did they become smaller, the number of clones had also increased. What's the use of having more clones? Fatty had obviously noticed this as well, but he still had a disdainful expression on his face as he waved his hands towards one clone after another, smashing them. Fatty waved his right fist, and like a skewer, he smashed the chests of 4 clones with a single punch, taking the opportunity to throw out his left fist. However, at this moment, 3 clones rushed out from behind Fatty. 2 of them attacked Fatty's waist, while the other bent down and rammed into Fatty's thigh. At the same time Fatty swung out his left fist, he kicked his right leg behind him. The clone that wanted to destroy his center of gravity and the clone that wanted to attack his right waist were all shattered by the kick. As for the clone that wanted to attack his left waist, it was already within reach. Fatty cursed in his heart. His agile and fat body twisted slightly to the other side. Hiss! The clone slashed open the clothes on Fatty's waist with his palm blade. It scraped through a layer of his skin and left behind a bloody mark. Fatty had already retracted his left fist. He took the opportunity to push his elbow in and smashed the head of the clone under his ribs. Bang! The clone shattered and turned into a lump of mucus, disappearing into the netherworld prison. After suffering this loss, Fatty did not dare to continue being careless. He opened and closed his arms with a nimble heart. Not long after, he once again eliminated many clones. Fatty stretched out his hand to wipe off the sweat on his forehead. From the corner of his eye, he saw that Fu Hu was smiling. His face turned cold. "What are you smiling for? You only know how to watch." Fu Hu did not argue with Fatty. After all, no matter what, he would definitely win in a quarrel. Fu Hu pointed ahead. There was a small protrusion there. In a short while, it would become the City Lord's clone. He said, "Every time you destroy them, they will split up once, and their numbers will multiply." And their strength did not decrease much after splitting up. If we just destroy them again and again, the result will be? Without needing Fu Hu to say anything, Fatty thought of that scene. That scene where the prison was filled with the City Lord's clone, and the two of them had no way of stepping down. Fatty frowned. "But we can't not fight. Are we going to let them attack us? They're coming out again. You finish them off, and I'll think of a way." Inside the netherworld prison, Lin Bai injected a thread of spirit energy into the small cauldron. With a buzz, the small cauldron emitted a dazzling golden light. A quarter of the prison area was illuminated. After Lin Bai's previous attempts, he found that if he injected only a little bit of spirit energy, the small cauldron would only emit a dazzling golden light. It could be used as a lamp. If he needed to use the small cauldron to illuminate for a long time, it would not consume too much spiritual power. However, if someone heard that Lin Bai used such a small cauldron as a lamp, many people would probably spit out blood and die. As expected, Lin Bai looked at the ground. There were tiny protrusions that were expanding and growing at a rapid speed. This was just as he had guessed. In the netherworld prison, every time the City Lord's clone was defeated, it would split up. Its strength would not decrease too much, but the number would increase exponentially. Little Blue had a troubled expression on its face. How could these people not die? Lin Bai saw Little Blue's expression and could not help but laugh. "Little Blue, don't worry. We will find a way." Little Blue heard this and heaved a sigh of relief. Its expression also eased up somewhat. Little Blue had complete trust in Lin Bai's words and actions. If Lin Bai said that he could live forever and become a deity, Little Blue would not hesitate to believe him. After handing over the City Lord's clones to Little Blue, Lin Bai quietly came to the edge of the prison and reached out a hand toward the darkness. Because his vision was blurry, Lin Bai could only use his physical body to experience the boundaries of the prison. Not long after, Lin Bai touched the ice-cold, solid barrier. Lin Bai drew his long sword and stabbed forward with all his strength. However, along with the sound of metal clashing, the barrier of the prison and the long sword in Lin Bai's hand remained unharmed. After that, Lin Bai tried a few more methods. He even tried to touch it with a small cauldron, but he did not leave a single mark on the barrier. Hee hee hee. A sinister and cold laughter sounded from outside the prison. "It's useless. With your cultivation, you won't be able to escape from the prison with brute force. Give up." The voice belonged to the City Lord. Lin Bai silently took a few steps back and tried his best to stay as far away from the prison walls as possible. Whoosh! At this moment, a faint sound of air being torn apart could be heard. Following that, Lin Bai's five senses told him that there was something that had passed through the prison walls and was attacking at lightning speed. Lin Bai did not hesitate to take out his small cauldron to protect himself. He then brandished the long sword in his right hand and stabbed at the approaching figure. Bang! The ear-piercing sound of metal colliding was heard, accompanied by sparks. With the weak light from the sparks, Lin Bai saw a familiar face. It was the City Lord. Lin Bai had clearly felt with his hands that there was an invincible barrier in the prison. Then, why could the City Lord ignore the barrier and use his physical body to pass through the barrier? Haha! The City Lord was quite happy when he saw the expression on Lin Bai's face. Do you know that when you set up a prison, the prison can be divided into two parts? You can only enter, you can only leave, and you can do neither? So that was the case. Lin Bai suddenly understood. The City Lord's netherworld prison prevented the people inside from escaping to a great extent, but it also allowed outsiders to enter to a great extent. From this, the walls of this prison could be considered to be indestructible. At the same time, it allowed the City Lord to pass through every prison without any hindrance. Within the prison, there were clones that could not be killed, and the number of clones increased exponentially. Outside the prison, there was the City Lord who was constantly wandering around, waiting for an opportunity to launch a sneak attack. Fortunately, Shan had already been heavily injured by Fatty. When Lin Bai thought of this, he let out a sigh of relief. If the City Lord and Shan were to use this prison together, then Lin Bai and the others would definitely not be able to retaliate. Losing Shan could be said to have reduced the difficulty from extremely difficult to difficult. As Lin Bai's thoughts drifted, he exchanged blows with the City Lord several times. Even though the City Lord had a great advantage in terms of cultivation, he would always wait for an opportunity to launch a sneak attack after giving it his all. This method seemed very stupid, but in reality, it could drain Lin Bai's energy bit by bit, erode Lin Bai's confidence, and even increase Lin Bai's burden. It could be said to be the method with the highest success rate. Lin Bai, it seems that you already have some understanding of how terrifying it is to be in the Netherworld prison. Not bad. I like your troubled expression. The City Lord's voice came from the darkness. But in the next second, the City Lord's voice sounded from another place. Hee hee hee. I gave you a chance long ago. I gave you a chance to throw yourself onto the ground and beg for mercy. But when the opportunity is right in front of you, you don't even know how to grasp it, so you can only... Whoosh! A piercing sound was heard. Lin Bai twisted his feet, and his right hand turned into a claw, clawing at his back. At the same time, he held the small cauldron in his left hand in front of him to protect himself. In the previous few battles, Lin Bai had already lost too much of his spirit energy to the small cauldron. Now, he only had a little bit of spirit energy left, so unless it was an emergency, he could only use the small cauldron as a shield for now. Bang! The sound of collision rang out. Lin Bai stood steadily on the spot, but the area between the thumb and forefinger of his sword was slightly numb. Not bad, not bad. It's just that you can hold on for a few more rounds. Let's take a look at your spirit beast. Lin Bai looked in the direction of Little Blue when he heard the sound. Little Blue had 30 to 40 City Lord clones around it. At first, Little Blue was quite relaxed, but now it had to fight with all its might. Fortunately, Little Blue's physical body was strong and sturdy. Even if he was accidentally hit by the City Lord clone, it would only be a small injury. But if the number of these clones continued to increase, he had to find a way to break it. Haha, Lin Bai, you will feel a little bit of what is called despair and what is called helplessness. I look forward to your helpless screams, cries, and pleas after you fall into despair. Just imagining it makes me feel unbearable. The City Lord's voice came from all directions. It was difficult for Lin Bai to control the other party's position. Whoosh! Bang! The sound of air being torn apart was accompanied by the sound of a battle. This was how the City Lord constantly used his words and the direction of the sound to deceive Lin Bai's ears and wait for an opportunity to take action. However, instead of taking action, Lin Bai felt that the City Lord was enjoying the feeling of toying with his prey, enjoying the process of making his prey fall into despair. A moment later, the City Lord once again approached Lin Bai. Just like the previous battles, he sent a palm strike towards Lin Bai's left shoulder, and Lin Bai also sent a palm strike out. But right at this moment, Lin Bai felt a City Lord at his back, waving a palm strike towards him. It was as easy as crushing dry weeds and rotten wood, cold and sinister, brutal and savage. Lin Bai could only abruptly retract the palm strike that he had sent out. Instead, he leaped up high and stepped on the palm of the City Lord. When the palms and feet collided, Lin Bai took advantage of the situation to attack behind him. He punched out, dispersing the palm force of the City Lord behind him. Although the City Lord's attack had been dissolved by Lin Bai, but just now, the City Lord's frontal attack had been split into two, and the power contained within was not much different, causing a thin layer of sweat to form on Lin Bai's forehead. This is my undying technique. Are you starting to regret not prostrating yourself before me and begging for mercy? Make the impossible possible. Lin Bai, do you think you can threaten me just because you hurt Shan and killed Ran? If you really think that, you're really disappointing me. The city lord's voice came intermittently from all directions in order to disrupt Lin Bai's judgment. Lin Bai stood where he was and stared at the darkness in front of him. He did not move at all. As for the clones that the city lord kept splitting up, they were all taken care of by Little Blue. That confident look and that disgusting look again. I'm going to gouge out your eyes. I'm going to cut out every piece of meat on your body and take a good look. What exactly is it that makes me feel so disgusted by you? The city lord cried out angrily. The city lord believed that he already had the advantage, and Lin Bai had no chance of turning the tables. However, even in such a situation, Lin Bai was still as casual as ever. Even if Mount Tai collapsed in front of him, he would not budge. It was this appearance that made the city lord feel disgusted and indignant. Suddenly, Lin Bai's sharp five senses sensed that the city lord was attacking from the front left. He protected himself by putting up his longsword and small cauldron in front of him in advance. However, just as the city lord was about to attack, he twisted at a strange angle and attacked Little Blue, who was entangled by many clones. Not good. Lin Bai cried out in his heart, not good. He exerted strength with his feet and followed closely behind the city lord. Little Blue's five senses were not inferior to Lin Bai's at all. It also noticed that the city lord was approaching at lightning speed. However, even though Little Blue was able to advance the gap and had the intention to defend and dodge, there were many clones of the city lord beside Little Blue. Moreover, these clones all pounced at the same time. They did not want to hurt Little Blue, but only wanted to stop Little Blue's movement. In a moment of desperation, Lin Bai activated his spiritual power and threw the long sword in his right hand, aiming at the city lord's back, using offense as defense. Otherwise, Lin Bai would not be able to make it in time. The speed of the sword that Lin Bai threw was already difficult to track with the naked eye. In the blink of an eye, the tip of the sword was about to reach the city lord's back. Bang! The city lord could only stop and use his hand as a blade to strike the side of the long sword, making a crisp sound like metal colliding. But at the same time, another city lord's clone appeared behind Little Blue and suddenly pulled out a leg to kick at Little Blue's head. At this time, Lin Bai had already arrived in front of the city lord. He swiftly and fiercely kicked at the city lord's calf, removing the tremendous force from this kick. Following that, Lin Bai seized the opportunity to grab the city lord's neck. After several rounds of exchanges, Lin Bai finally understood one thing. There were only two ways to coming out of the Netherworld prison: kill the city lord, and the cultivation technique would naturally disappear. The other way was to grab the city lord. Looking at the incoming palm, the city lord's expression changed greatly. He had never thought that Lin Bai would be so ruthless and decisive, directly aiming for his vital points. However, just as Lin Bai's hand was about to grab the city lord's neck, the city lord's face, which was filled with fear, regret, and the desire to retreat, was swept away. Instead, it was replaced by a face with a sinister smile. When Lin Bai's hand reached for the city lord's neck, he forcefully squeezed it. The city lord, who looked exactly the same as his original body, turned into a pitch-black, viscous liquid like a clone. Suddenly, a thick, murderous aura surged out from behind Lin Bai. A trap. The city lord was able to turn into a clone that looked exactly the same as his own body. Lin Bai had experienced this in the previous battles. Moreover, in many battles, the city lord had used such a realistic clone. This gave Lin Bai a subconscious illusion that the city lord could only use one such clone. However, from this step onwards, it was the city lord's trap. Up until now, the city lord had planned to sneak attack Little Blue twice. However, these two times were the city lord's realistic clone. As for the real city lord, he had already used his cultivation technique to wait for an opportunity in the dark. Azura Palm. The city lord's true attack came crashing down towards Lin Bai in all directions, bringing with it endless murderous intent and killing intent. The city lord's palm attack caused figures to appear around him. Each figure was faint and sinister. Under each Azura's feet were hundreds of millions of corpses. A sea of blood surged into the sky. These Asuras seemed to have materialized. They revealed a murderous intent that could not be looked at directly. If Lin Bai's state of mind was not firm, he would have been defeated by a crack in his state of mind just by experiencing the illusory murderous intent of the Asura. Lin Bai wanted to use his spiritual power to enter the small cauldron, but his current spiritual power was no longer enough to use the small cauldron again. He could only use the small cauldron as a shield in front of his chest. The long sword in his right hand kept swinging out, intending to use it to deflect some of the force of the palm. The smell of death. Lin Bai could feel the smell that was the closest to death. At this moment, his entire body became very quiet. Everything slowed down. The long sword in his hand and the palm of the city lord were all moving at the speed of a tortoise. Little Blue also felt the power of the Asura palm. It took 2 steps at a time and rushed towards Lin Bai and the city lord like a madman. However, it was too late. Buzz. A burst of dazzling black gold light burst out from the small cauldron. The entire pitch-black prison that was so pitch-black that one could not even see one's fingers was illuminated. The pitch-black clones of the city lord that were fighting with Little Blue dispersed the moment they were illuminated by this dense light. 4 black gold light pillars were circulating with profound laws. They appeared around the city lord's body out of thin air. Then, they suddenly shot toward the city lord. Lin Bai could feel the black golden light from the small cauldron. The 4 black golden pillars of light appeared. The life force in his body flowed into the small cauldron like a stream. But now, Lin Bai could only grit his teeth and persevere. Even if he took half a step back, what awaited him was only death. The black golden pillars of light collided with the Asura illusion created by the city lord's Asura palm. The awe-inspiring and murderous Shura dispersed, but the pillars of light did not show any signs of stopping. The city lord's expression changed drastically. He had never expected such a turn of events. He subconsciously twisted his palm and smashed it towards the 4 beams of light. An innate feeling was constantly telling the city lord that he had to block this move. He had to block this move. Rumble. The Asura palm and the black golden beam of light collided, creating a violent wave of air. Little Blue was even blown away and crashed heavily into the prison wall. No! The city lord's roar sounded out, but it stopped abruptly in the end. The prison that Lin Bai was in also collapsed from the inside as the 2 of them fought. The light from the outside slowly shone in. Rumble. Rocks kept falling from the sky above the altar, accompanied by heavy dust. A moment later, the entire altar was in a mess. This? What's going on, Pant? Fatty saw that the netherworld prison had dispersed, and the light from the outside world shone in. Even though rocks kept falling, he felt that there was no better scenery than this. He let out a long sigh and simply lay down. He was in the netherworld prison and constantly fought with the city lord's clones. However, the more clones he killed, the more clones he split. In the end, the number of clones reached a terrifying number. If the netherworld prison had not collapsed and caused a large number of clones to disappear, he and Fu Hu might have died there. Fu Hu narrowed his eyes. He wanted to see all aspects of the altar through the thick dust. He said calmly, "It seems that the battle between Lin Bai and the city lord has ended. Then who will win and who will lose?" Fatty, who was already lying down, heard this and sat up. His eyes revealed some worry. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. After a few strange sounds, the dust on the altar swept away with a gust of strong wind, revealing the original appearance of the altar. "Look over there." Fatty revealed a surprised expression. He pointed forward as if he had seen something extraordinary. The city lord was panting and covered in blood as he stood in front of Sean. If that was all, Fatty wouldn't have revealed such a surprised expression. He had seen many scenes with Lin Bai over the past few days, so he wouldn't be scared by ordinary scenes. However, the city lord in front of him was too terrifying. There was a deep scratch on the city lord's face from the corner of his right eyebrow. The skin on the scratch was like a piece of paper with blood flowing out of it, revealing the inside of the scratch. The inside of the scratch was a pale face covered by a pale yellow skin. There was also a pair of dark red eyes that flickered with killing intent and endless hatred. For some reason, when FFDTY saw the true face of the city lord under the skin, he felt a chill run down his spine, and his hands and feet became even colder. But in the next second, he saw Lin Bai standing there, and the fear in his heart dissipated a little. The thin man also came out from the netherworld prison. With an expression of having survived a disaster, he hurried to Lin Bai's side and asked in a low voice, "Is this the true face of the city lord?" Lin Bai nodded as an answer. He was still reminiscing about the attack that he had just used with the small cauldron. He could clearly feel that his life had flowed from his fingertips into the small cauldron, and he had relied on that attack to heavily injure the city lord. This made Lin Bai feel a lingering fear. If this small cauldron had gone crazy and devoured his life without any bottom line, then he would have already been a mummy, dying in battle with the city lord. As expected, there were still many secrets on this little cauldron, and he could not use some of his abilities rashly. He needed to verify it bit by bit, disassemble it, and confirm it, or else he would have to pay an even greater price. Lin Bai muttered in his heart and made up his mind to properly investigate this little cauldron. However, it was not now. Lin Bai estimated that there was still spiritual energy left, and then he raised his head to look at the weakened city lord. There was a chance. Little Blue and Little Black moved closer to him. The two little beasts looked at the city lord who was on the verge of death, and their eyes were shining with golden light, eager to help Lin Bai. "This won't do. Maybe next time." Lin Bai shook his head, and his tone was somewhat serious. When the two little beasts heard this, although there was some regret in their eyes, they could only obediently retreat to the side. Lin Bai injected a trace of spiritual power into the small cauldron, and the small cauldron floated up leisurely, protecting Lin Bai's chest. In front, because his spiritual power was already insufficient, Lin Bai could only temporarily use the small cauldron as a shield to block the city lord's attack. Lin Bai held the long sword in his right hand, and his figure flashed like a gust of wind. He floated in front of the city lord, and the tip of the sword was directly between the city lord's brows. The sword aura was pressing, and his attacks were ruthless. The city lord's face was gloomy. Seeing Lin Bai rushing over, he waved his bare hands and punched toward the sword hilt. Boom! The sword and fist collided, and the air billowed. The city lord took a step back and spat out a mouthful of blood. He looked gloomily at Lin Bai, who was protecting his chest. The small cauldron in front of him? It was this small cauldron's previous attack that had put him at a disadvantage. He had no choice but to change this disguise. At the thought of this, the city lord's hatred and killing intent towards Lin Bai surged like a surging river. When the fatty and the skinny man felt this intent that carried strong emotions, they could not help but shudder. Their eyes slowly became solemn. The city lord steadied his body and spat out a mouthful of saliva mixed with blood. He suddenly charged forward and grabbed the white bone halberd from Shan with his backhand, waving it around. With every swing, it seemed as if there were countless resentful spirits wailing, piercing straight into people's hearts. Lin Bai remained calm and unperturbed. With a flick of the long sword in his hand, he staggered away from the body of the white bone halberd. The white bone halberd pierced into the small cauldron, emitting an ear-splitting clanging sound. Lin Bai took the opportunity to swing the long sword and headed straight for the city lord's hands. The two of them had already used up too much spiritual power at this time, and could only use these basic killing moves to win. Heh, you were so cocky before, but now you're shabby. The fatty's nimble body had unknowingly appeared behind the city lord, his face carrying a disdainful smile. Go to hell. The skinny man's eyes were sharp. He had seen everything when Lin Bai and the city lord had exchanged blows, so he knew very well that the city lord was already at the end of his rope. Little Blue and Little Black, the two little beasts, saw that Lin Bai and the other two were about to give the city lord a final blow, and their eyes emitted a golden light. The city lord's eyes were filled with hatred. Like an enraged, desolate beast, he roared as he attacked the three of them. No, that's not right. Lin Bai wanted to open his mouth to make the fatty and the other two retreat, but it was already too late. After the city lord fought with Lin Bai, he deliberately took a step back, and that mouthful of blood could also be an act. It was just to deceive the crowd and mistakenly think that he was in a desperate situation. As a result, he would more or less let his guard down and reveal a flaw. The City Lord's entire body shot out a red glow, and his speed increased explosively. Both of his hands were surrounded by a sinister black aura, and with a speed that was difficult for the naked eye to find, he began to attack like a wild beast. Lin Bai adjusted his body and had his longsword slash straight at the City Lord's hands, using offense as defense. Fatty and Thin Man had already sensed that something was wrong. They cursed the City Lord in their hearts for being sinister, and then used all of their life-saving skills. Boom, boom, boom. After 3 explosive sounds, Lin Bai and the other 2 retreated. Lin Bai relied on his offense as a defense and was considered safe and sound. However, he did not dare to be careless with the City Lord anymore. Fatty and Skinny both spat out a mouthful of blood. The injuries that Skinny had previously were stacked together with this time. Now, he could only use 30% of his strength. F*CK. What a F*King dirty trick. Fatty cursed loudly. Saliva flew out of his mouth. At this moment, he saw from the corner of his eyes Fu who had taken root on the ground. He started cursing again. You've already noticed that something is wrong, right? No, I didn't. I'm not. Lin Bai noticed the conversation between Fu and Fatty, but he didn't pay much attention to it. At first, he had guessed that perhaps the City Lord was just pretending to be at the end of his rope, but was actually hiding his strength to fish. But he didn't choose to make a move, and Fu wouldn't make a move either. If Fatty and Skinny went up alone, they would only suffer even more serious injuries. The most important point was that they could not give the City Lord a chance to catch his breath. They had all seen how terrifying Ran and Shan's recovery ability was. The City Lord's strength was above these 2. One could only imagine the City Lord's self-healing ability. The City Lord's attack succeeded. He did not stop. His entire body was filled with demon chi. It carried the hidden resentment of thousands of creatures as he charged towards the crowd. Although he was not at the end of his rope, he knew that he was in a disadvantageous position. It was very rare for him to take advantage of this opportunity to pursue and attack. Once he missed the opportunity to heavily injure Lin Bai and the others, he would not be able to do it again. F*CK. Fatty sensed that the City Lord was coming towards him and cursed. He quickly used all kinds of defensive methods, and colorful lights protected his body. The City Lord was too fast and too decisive. Fatty's defense had not been activated yet, and before Skinny could react, a vicious attack was aimed at Fatty's chest. Bang! Before this attack hit Fatty's chest, Lin Bai took a step forward first and activated the small cauldron that was glowing with golden light to protect Fatty. He steadily received this attack. The City Lord's face revealed a look of irritation as he stared at the small cauldron that was filled with flames. He could neither recognize nor see through the small cauldron. However, not only was it able to block his attacks time and time again, but there wasn't a single crack on the small cauldron's body. It was completely intact. The Thin Man who was a step late, Lin Bai who had blocked the attack, and Little Green and Little Red who were preparing to continue attack together. All sorts of rays of light carried a terrifying aura as they pounced towards the City Lord. Shan watched this scene and felt extremely nervous. He wanted to help the City Lord, but he also knew that if he went up now, he would only be dragging the City Lord down. The City Lord fought with Lin Bai and the others with great difficulty. He did not dare to be the slightest bit careless. As long as he revealed a flaw, there would be many loopholes and he would be defeated. The more Fatty attacked, the more shocked he became. If it was not for Lin Bai helping him, with the City Lord's remaining strength, he would have died on the spot. At the same time, Fatty glanced at Fu from the corner of his eyes. Seeing that Fu was still standing on the spot, as if roots had grown under his feet, he cursed in his heart. Coward! Lin Bai took advantage of the gap between the City Lord and Little Red. His feet were like dragonflies skimming the water, and his figure was like a gust of wind. He held the long sword tightly with one hand and stabbed it at the City Lord's left rib. The City Lord hurriedly blocked Little Red's attack. His right foot took a small step forward, and his body twisted to the left. He took the opportunity to push out a sword and smashed it toward the long sword. At this moment, Fu Hu, who had been standing in the same spot, moved. He held a long sword in his hand and hacked down from above, swearing to chop off the city lord's right hand. The city lord was shocked. He had already pushed out his right hand. It was impossible to stop. His eyes were red. He gritted his teeth and spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood splattered onto the surrounding demonic chi, like oil pouring onto a bonfire. The demonic chi suddenly surged and expanded, enveloping the city lord's body in an instant. However, the city lord still didn't have enough measures. He took out a small sword with his left hand and swung it at the long sword in Fu Hu's hand, trying to deflect some of the force. Bang! The sound of metal colliding rang out. The long sword in Fu Hu's hand didn't hit the city lord's right hand as expected, but it was blocked by the long sword that appeared in the middle. City Lord, forgive your subordinates' incompetence for rushing over later. A man with sword-like eyebrows and red eyes, who was emitting energy and holding a long sword, spoke with a sonorous voice. It was Yang Xing. Seeing this, the city lord did not let go of this opportunity. After striking the long sword in Lin Bai's hand, he used his hand that was surrounded by a large amount of demonic chi to strike at the fatty. The fatty had not expected this attack. He was hit on his right shoulder and spat out a mouthful of black blood as he retreated to the corner of the altar. After heavily injuring Fatty, the city lord did not chase after him. Instead, he and Yang Xing attacked Lin Bai and Fu Hu together. With Yang Xing joining in, Lin Bai's side was evenly matched. If you want to kill the city lord, then you'll have to step over my corpse. Yang Xing roared angrily. The long sword in his hand swung open and closed. He did not care about defense at all. Instead, as he attacked, he let out waves of roars. Fu Hu found Yang Xing's weakness. He swung the long sword in his hand and slashed at Yang Xing's wrist. However, Yang Xing did not dodge at all. He continued to swing the long sword in his hand and stabbed at Fu Hu's neck. F***CK. Fu Hu cursed in his heart. He could only retreat. He could already sense that Yang Xing had fallen into a state of madness. He would not hesitate to use a move that would hurt the enemy and hurt himself. Fu Hu had the biggest headache when dealing with this kind of person. Yang Xing saw Fu Hu's fear and chased after him. He waved his long sword and thrust it directly at Fu Hu's left chest. While Fu Hu was retreating, he threw out a few daggers. However, Yang Xing still did not dodge. In the blink of an eye, he was in front of Fu Hu. Fu Hu gritted his teeth and swung his knife. It grazed Yang Xing's chest and left a bloody wound. The long sword in Yang Xing's hand also pierced into Fu Hu's arm and pierced through it. "Where are you looking?" The city lord shouted loudly. His body was like a ghost as he closed in on Lin Bai. His hand was like a ghost claw as it reached for Lin Bai's heart. Before the claw reached him, Lin Bai felt that his chest was wrapped by a force that made it difficult for him to breathe. He clenched his teeth and pulled out a leg, kicking at the city lord hand claw. Boom! With a rumble, Lin Bai took a step back. The city lord estimated the distance and waved his hand once again. However, the city lord did not expect that Lin Bai would turn his head and rush towards Yang Xing as soon as he struck out with his palm, brandishing the long sword in his hand. Lin Bai. How could the city lord not know what Lin Bai was thinking? Lin Bai wanted to take advantage of the situation to finish off one person and then exhaust him to death. The city lord wanted to chase after him, but it was already too late. Yang Xing sensed the strange situation behind him and wanted to react. He could not let the enemy hurt him for nothing. However, Fu Hu, who had finally caught his breath, would not let go of such an opportunity. He forcefully held Yang Xing back. Swoosh! Blood splattered everywhere, and his arm flew up. Yang Xing's left arm was split open from his shoulder. His severed arm was fluttering with blood as he flew high into the sky. The heart-wrenching pain made Yang Xing lose his mind, and the pain almost made him faint. Ah! The heavily injured Yang Xing was like a child with many loopholes and empty weapons. Lin Bai and Fu Hu naturally would not let go of this opportunity. They held their weapons and planned to give Yang Xing a final blow. However, at the same time, Lin Bai saw from the corner of his eye that the city lord's originally indignant face had turned into a sinister smile, and his lips were pursed. Lin Bai sensed that something was wrong and shouted at Fu Hu, "Get out of the way!" Ah! Yang Xing let out a heart-wrenching scream that sent chills down people's spines. His body swelled up like a balloon that had been inflated. His eyes bulged out as if they were about to fall off. His entire body swelled up by more than 4 to 5 times. This only happened in an instant. Fu Hu, who was the closest to Yang Xing, had yet to understand the current situation when a series of intense explosions sounded. Yang Xing was buried in the blood mist, and the sky was filled with meat, bones, and organs. A powerful energy burst out from Yang Xing's body, and his aura was like rolling river water, crushing everything in its path. Fu Hu felt despair in his heart, and he subconsciously used all kinds of life-saving methods. Layer after layer of talismans and layer after layer of treasure light enveloped his body. In the next second, Fu Hu was enveloped in a terrifying explosion. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The entire secret chamber trembled violently, as if the world was about to be turned upside down. Even in the capital city outside the secret chamber, many people could feel the ground beneath their feet shaking slightly. Fu Hu lost his sight, and his gut felt as if it had been crushed by an elephant. He couldn't help but puke out a mouthful of scarlet blood, and his body subconsciously retreated continuously. However, before Fu Hu could take a few steps back, his head felt as if it had been filled with lead water. His body fell heavily onto the ground, and he fainted. Fatty was one step ahead of Fu Hu and pulled away from Yang Xing. However, under the power of the self-explosion, he felt his internal organs churning and he felt dizzy. Before he could stabilize his mind, he heard a piercing sound. Shwa. Blood splattered everywhere. The fat man's back was cut open from his left shoulder to his right waist. There was a deep wound, and he fainted due to the intense pain and the self-explosion. Humph! A cold voice echoed on the altar. You two traitors. You have forgotten who helped you seize the good fortune and gain one step closer to immortality. The city lord stuck out his tongue and licked the blood on his hand. He frowned as if he had tasted something extremely disgusting and spat. Even the blood of traitors is so smelly. What a killjoy. The city lord could not help but step on the fatty's back again. This time, he stepped on the wound, causing the flesh to roll open, and one could vaguely see the dense white bones. The city lord did not feel relieved at all. He raised his right leg high and aimed at the back of the fatty's head. He was ready to stomp down like stepping on tofu. I'll kill you. The skinny man's eyes were about to split open. He was furious. Even though he was heavily wounded, he still held the dagger in his hand and charged at the city lord like a fierce beast. But the skinny man was too late. However, just as this foot was about to land, a sword light that was wrapped in cold air stabbed towards the city lord at lightning speed. What a pity! After being stopped, the city lord did not feel angry. He retracted his foot that was about to land and dodged to the side. A smile appeared on his face. This smile made people feel disgusted, and it made people feel a chill in their hearts. Lin Bai's expression was as dark as water. A monstrous killing intent was emitted from within as his eyes were like torches as he stared at the city lord. Yang Xing's sudden self-detonation must have been the city lord's intent. The city lord had already placed restrictions on these chess pieces and had given up on them at the appropriate time. This self-detonation had left Fu Hu's life unknown, and the city lord had even made Fatty lie in a pool of blood. In the eyes of the city lord before him, human lives were like ants that could be casually trampled to death by the roadside. He did not care at all. Killing intent and hatred surged. The small cauldron floating in front of him buzzed and shone with golden light. Fatty and Fu Hu were still alive. The thin man shouted loudly. His voice was hoarse and filled with intense anger. Lin Bai nodded silently. When his chin reached its lowest point, the thin man's robe fluttered and his hair was blown wildly in the wind. When the thin man opened his eyes again, Lin Bai had already arrived in front of the city lord. Hey kid, where's the look in your eyes from before? Gone. Gone. The city lord shouted crazily, And when he looked at Lin Bai, who was full of murderous intent and overflowing hatred, he could not help but feel his heart tremble, and an inexplicable emotion surged out. Undying Ghost Technique, Netherworld, the City Lord shouted. At the same time, the demonic chi around his body grew 10 times stronger in the blink of an eye. It wrapped around his body and 4 limbs and stuck to his body like a supreme armor. It was accompanied by endless cries, roars, and curses. Little Green, Little Red, and the other little beasts wanted to go forward and help Lin Bai. However, as soon as the little beasts stepped out, a clone of the City Lord appeared in front of them and began an intense battle. However, the price of this netherworld was also very obvious. The flesh and blood on the City Lord's face were disappearing, and his body was slowly drying up. Looking at the small cauldron that was shining with golden light, the City Lord suddenly punched out towards the body of the small cauldron. Boom! The two collided, causing a violent force. Both of them took a few steps back. Lin Bai's feet had just stabilized when he took another step forward and suddenly rushed towards the City Lord. He did not care that his life force was slowly flowing into the small cauldron. Lin Bai's spiritual power was exhausted, so he could only use his life force to activate the small cauldron. However, the terrifying power brought by using his life force to activate the small cauldron made every inch of his bones and tendons bear a huge pressure. It was as if they were going to be crushed and torn apart. Boom! The two of them collided again and took a few steps back. There was blood at the corner of the City Lord's mouth, but Lin Bai was the only one in his eyes. There was also blood at the corner of Lin Bai's mouth. It was obvious that he was not feeling well. Bang! 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 The two of them attacked time and time again. They were injured time and time again, and their lives were being drained bit by bit. And if anyone in the current battle felt fear due to the loss of their lives and hesitated, or even did not dare to attack, then they would be doomed to lose. Obviously, the two of them, who were overflowing with battle intent, would not retreat. This battle had become a tug-of-war. Little Black looked in Lin Bai's direction. He instinctively felt that the situation was not good. He wanted to break the stalemate time and time again, but he was stopped by the City Lord's clone. The other small beasts also roared and roared. However, they could only enter the battle in front of them and could not escape at all. Lin Bai, you're already at the end of your rope. What are you still holding on for? The City Lord's mouth was dripping with blood, which had dyed the front of his robe red. His scarlet eyes were filled with ruthlessness. You are also at the end of your rope. Why don't you stop? I will help you escape from the sea of bitterness. Lin Bai's face was gloomy as he said coldly. Lin Bai had already begun to weaken. The load on his body had also caused his bones to start cracking. However, he knew that he could not stop now. He took out the small cauldron and charged again. The City Lord was unwilling to be outdone. He raised his fist that was surrounded by demonic chi and smashed it towards Lin Bai. Rumble. Right at this moment, the altar began to shake violently, and huge rocks kept falling from above. However, they had already struck out with this attack and could not stop at all. Boom! The altar started to crumble bit by bit. Huge rocks that were as big as small mountains kept falling from the sky, and the entire secret chamber began to collapse. A few days later, in the capital, the first ray of sunlight shone into the house through the window leaves. A gentle breeze blew past, bringing with it the refreshing feeling of the morning. There was a figure that was black and shiny all over, clumsy, and a figure that was jumping up and down, scratching his ears and cheeks. With the cooperation of the two, they carefully opened the window and looked down at the person on the bed. The two of them looked at each other as if they were planning something. Hey, you two, didn't I say that I would impart you cultivation today? Why are you in such a hurry? Lin Bai slowly opened his eyes and started to scold them jokingly. He used his elbow to support himself on the bed and slowly sat up. However, the tearing sensation from his muscles made him involuntarily open his mouth. When Little Black and Little Blue saw this, they looked worried in their expressions after doing something bad. It's okay, it's okay. Lin Bai stretched out his hand and played with the two little beasts. The armor on Little Black's body was ice cold. As soon as he touched it, Lin Bai felt a chill rush into his body, and the tiredness when he woke up was swept away. The hair on Little Blue was long, soft, and smooth. It was quite nice to touch. As he touched the two little beasts, Lin Bai recalled what had happened a few days ago. That day, the secret chamber collapsed, and they and the city lord fell into the abyss. Little Red desperately wanted to catch Lin Bai and every small beast, but in the end, it was too weak. It could only watch as more people and small beasts fell into the abyss. Just as despair rose in their hearts, they suddenly realized that there was a turbulent undercurrent under the abyss. As a result, they were able to save their lives and escape from the secret chamber by following the undercurrent. Ever since Lin Bai had fallen into the undercurrent, he had been focused on searching for traces of the city lord and Shan. However, until they escaped from the underground, they had not been able to find any traces of the city lord and Shan. After that, they rested in the wilderness for a night before returning to the capital and returning to Bai Shi's home. Bai Shi, Fatty, Skinny, and Fu Hu were all heavily injured. The butler of the Bai Shi manor had come forward and invited a doctor who could be trusted and had superb medical skills to treat them. Other than Fatty and Fu Hu, who hadn't woken up for a long time, Bai Shi and Thin Man were only physically weak. They could only recuperate in their rooms for the time being and weren't allowed to go out. Everything that had happened in the city lord's estate, the secret chamber beneath the city lord's manor, and the demonic chi that remained in the secret chamber soon caused a stir in the entire capital. All the major powers and clans were looking for the city lord, but they were unable to find him. The entire capital was in an uproar. Lin Bai stayed in Bai Shi's manor and recuperated in peace. He paid no attention to what was happening outside the window. After a few days, his body gradually recovered. Yesterday, he had told the little beasts that he was ready to start imparting his strength the next day. Today, this scene had happened early in the morning. Lin Bai washed up and ate some more. The maid had already prepared breakfast. He drank a cup of hot tea and let out a long sigh of relief. The blue sky and white clouds that he was used to in the past had become fresh in Lin Bai's eyes after the great tragedy. After immersing himself in the scenery for a while, Lin Bai only felt the leg of his pants being pulled. He saw Little Blue and Little Black looking up at him. Lin Bai scolded them with a smile. He went to the bamboo forest in the courtyard and sat on an exquisite stone bench. Little Green, come. Lin Bai waved his hand at Little Green. Little Green came up to him with a face full of joy, while the other little beasts looked regretful. There's some for everyone. Don't worry. Lin Bai could not help but feel amused. Hearing his promise, the other little beasts smiled again. System, I want to pass on my cultivation to Little Green, Lin Bai said in his heart. Ding. The host has passed on 50 days of cultivation to Little Green. 70 times of return has been successfully triggered. The host has received 3,500 days of return of cultivation. Lin Bai only felt a surge of cultivation surging into him. It was as if a long drought had brought sweet dew, comfortable and refreshing. Little Green rubbed against Lin Bai's arm in satisfaction, while Little Red was already flapping its wings, unable to wait any longer. Come, Little Red. Lin Bai patted Little Red's head lovingly. A warm feeling came from his palm, making him feel warm all over. Ding. The host has given Little Red 50 days of cultivation. 40-fold return has been successfully triggered. The host has received 2,000-fold return of cultivation. Little Black blinked its jet black eyes and looked at Lin Bai. Lin Bai could not help but smile. Ding. The host has given Little Black 50 days of cultivation. 60-fold return has been successfully triggered. The host has received 3,000 days of cultivation. After half a day, every little beast was satisfied and stood beside Lin Bai. Lin Bai felt the cultivation surging into his body and nodded his head in satisfaction. If he continued to increase his cultivation, he was confident that he would be able to finish the city lord off the next time he met the city lord. Lin Bai took out the small cauldron again. The small cauldron floated in front of him with a faint luster. Let's test your power. As Lin Bai spoke, he urged his spiritual power and crazily poured it into the small cauldron. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The small cauldron's entire body shone with golden light. The originally simple body of the cauldron seemed to have turned into gold, and there was a majestic and terrifying power circulating within the small cauldron. The few small beasts stared at the small cauldron with their eyes wide open. Not bad. It's just as I guessed. The higher the cultivation, the more spiritual energy that is surged into the small cauldron, and the greater the power that the small cauldron can unleash. Then, where is the limit? Lin Bai suddenly looked forward to what kind of power this small cauldron could unleash when his cultivation was unfathomable in the future. Moreover, during these days, Lin Bai could only recuperate from his injuries. In his spare time, he would ponder over this small cauldron. Other than activating his spiritual power and life force to launch the most ordinary attacks, Lin Bai also discovered some special points. However, due to the injuries on his body, he could only put this aside for now. At this moment, at the other end of the courtyard, an old man with snow-white hair, ruddy complexion, and a stooped figure walked in. There was a faint smile on the corners of the old man's mouth. Elder Sure. Lin Bai stood up when he saw the old man. His eyes were filled with hope. Elder Sure was Bai Shi's butler. He had followed Bai Shi